Bravo, got a roll program. Stand by for mode 1, Charlie. Roger, Tower. Launch sequence engaged. We are go.
Because if you're going to talk about faith and you're going to talk about religion, you have to talk about this. As a matter of fact, for many of you, you think that this is the whole point of faith and religion. Because today, I want to talk to you about the role of rules. Aren't you so excited? Aren't you so excited that you came to hear about rules? And some of you are thinking, I knew this was coming. I knew this was coming. I can't believe that I got out of bed for this. It's 12:30. You should be out of bed, okay? Let's just be honest about that. No matter what, you should be out of bed. But for most of us, it's not something that we get excited. Some of you, you do get excited about rules. Some of you are rule followers. You're the ones who literally walk into the pool area and you won't get on the water until you find the rules. You're like, where's the rule board? Oh my goodness, there's not a rule board. I don't think you can swim here. People will just die. And you love the rules. And I'm not going to give you a hard time about that. When I was younger, I didn't like you. I didn't like you because you told on me. Or even worse, you would tell me the rules. And then that totally destroyed my ability to claim ignorance. And I get so angry. I'm like, if I didn't know that, I could have done it and just said I didn't know. But now you ruined it for me. But some of you, that's your thing. And as I got older, I've learned to appreciate you more. And when you become a parent, you appreciate the rule people. And I tell my kids, you should be friends with those people. I know they're not fun, but they'll keep you alive. That's why God created them. They keep the rest of us alive. That's what they do. And as we walk into this, I realize we come from very different places as it pertains to this, some of us, but it's incredibly important because anytime that you're talking about faith, you have to talk about rules. And every religion has a set of rules. And so when you look at Islam, you see the 5 pillars of Islam. And when you look at Judaism, you see the 10 Commandments. And Christianity, you see the Sermon on the Mount. Every religion has a set of rules. And they have a rule maker. It's not you, unfortunately, but they have a rule maker. And that rule maker sets out, okay, this is the instructions of how to be able to engage and live life. And the thing that makes it even more complicated is that even inside of each of these, there are different groups with different sets of rules. And all of us were trying to figure this whole thing out. I remember growing up, I grew up in a church that had a lot of rules. If there wasn't a rule about something, we felt very uncomfortable. And we thought to ourselves, well, we need to have a business meeting. We need to make a rule about this. There can't be something that there's not a rule about. And I remember I went to my friend's youth group. They didn't have enough rules. I looked around and said, this is very unhealthy, but I like it. I like it here. Some of you actually chose the religion that you chose because of the rules. You thought, well, I feel like I could go with these rules. They seem to fit my lifestyle. Some of you chose the church that you chose because of the rules. You said, this church is they're not too strict on the rules. All of us were trying to figure this out. What is the relationship between God and the rules? And how does this work as it pertains to church? Some of you weren't good at keeping the rules and you were actually asked to leave because of the rules. Some of you left not because you were asked to leave, but you looked at the rules and said, no one's going to be able to keep those rules. And all of you are just lying to each other about whether you're keeping those rules. And so you walked away. How does this work? There's no way that we can restart our faith if we don't figure out, okay, how does this work? And all of us have to work through, at some point, every single one of us has to work through the relationship between our behavior and our relationship with God. How does my behavior impact my relationship with God, because as we talked about a couple weeks ago, we're not just a mistaker. And as we talked about last week, we can make an unbelievable mess of our lives. And to be honest, we can make a mess of other people's lives as well. And then you look at these different groups of rules and how does my behavior impact my relationship with God? What is this whole rules thing about? And I think this is important, not just because we need to understand it, but I think it's important because God has something really powerful for us in this. But before we get there, I want to make sure that we understand a foundational principle as it pertains to rules. And most of us know this, although we've never actually processed this. So you'll hear this and you'll say, oh yeah, that's true, but we've never actually thought through this in terms of how we engage rules or how we engage our life. But it's important that we understand. Rules, listen to me, rules always assume a relationship. Rules always assume a relationship. And so we come together in social groups, and as we come together in social groups, we make rules so that we can be in relationship to one another. And as we're engaging with one another, we realize, okay, there needs to be certain rules in order for us to really thrive socially together, for us to be able to care for one another, for us to be able to love one another, for us to be able to be in relationship with one another. Interestingly enough, even the rules that you make for yourself take place in terms of relationship. It's just the relationship between the healthy you and the dumb you. And so you realize the healthy you steps into the room and says to the dumb you, turns out you can't eat 5 donuts a day and live. It just doesn't work that way. And so you make a rule and you decide, okay, we're just gonna eat 2 donuts a day and you hope you don't go past 3. And you make that rule, and there's this relationship out of which that rule is born. The other interesting thing about rules is that even the rules you make for yourself, you can't keep. And you look at it sometimes and you say, man, I wish I was the rule maker. It really wouldn't matter if you were the rule maker because you don't keep the rules that you make for yourself. And you told yourself at the beginning of the year that you were going to work out 5 days a week. Now you tell yourself, I walked up the stairs to work. And then I walked down for lunch. I'm doing well. But we don't even keep the rules that we make for ourselves. So how does this work? Rules always assume a relationship. And there's several different models in which this takes place, different ways in which this plays out. I'm sure there's tons of different ways that this plays out, but there's 3 in particular that I want to draw your attention to today. The first one is the family model. So inside of the family model, you have rules because of the fact that you're part of this family. So you're born into, or you're adopted into, or you marry into this family, and inside the family there are certain rules. Now, you're not part of the family because you agreed to keep the rules. You're part of the family because you were born into that family, or you are adopted or married into that family. And those rules are specifically for that family. And even if you break the rules, you're not kicked out of the family. Now, some of you had families that operated that way, and they treat you like you're not part of the family, but you're still part of the family. You can't kick someone out of that. You can act like they're not, but they're still part of the family. The other really interesting thing is that, again, these rules apply specifically to that family. They only apply to that family. And sometimes we wish we could make rules for other people's families, but you can't. And you wish you could say, you know what, your kids can't come to the park anymore because they constantly cause problems. Or you could say, you know what, your kids need to sit down when they're at a restaurant. I shared that one at the second service. All the parents got real quiet. Apparently, that's a bigger problem than I thought. So, but inside of it, you understand, these are rules for our family. Another model that's very different is the club model. Now, when it comes to the club model, in this situation, you're not part of the club and then there's rules. No, there's rules, and then if you agree to keep the rules, then you can join the club. But if you break the rules, you decide you don't want to follow the rules anymore, then you get kicked out of the club. And so it's a very conditional situation. And you understand, okay, I have to pay the dues and I have to show up a certain amount of time and I have to, all of the different things, whatever the rules are, I agree to those rules. That allows me to be part of the club. As long as I keep the rules, I'm part of the club. If I don't, then I'm out of the club. These two are pretty clear cut. The last one's a little more interesting. The condo association model. This one you buy into and they can't really kick you out. So they just try to make you feel really bad until you opt out. You buy it and they share with you all these rules that you don't know who made or where they came from, but you have to keep them. Otherwise, someone's going to start sending emails about the person who's not very good at recycling or the neighbor who constantly props the door open. All these, and you look at these different models, you see that there's different ways that this plays out. But in all of these, there's rules because of the fact that there's relationship. Rules always assume a relationship. And so not only do we have to figure out, okay, what's the right set of rules, but then figure out how does my behavior impact that relationship that I have with God. And when it comes to these different models and how rules relate to relationship, okay, God, how does this work? Which is why for many of us, we're left confused. And we can't figure out. I know there are rules. I don't know the role of rules. I don't know how it works. Let me ask you this. As you grew up and you experienced religion, or in the church that you grew up in, which one was it? Maybe you were taught this one, but you experienced this one. Or maybe it wasn't that you were out, it's just that they were going to make sure that you felt really, really bad until you opted out or until you changed. Which one was it? And more importantly, which one is it? Now, to get clarity on this, I want to take you to what I believe is the most famous rules in the world. It's a set of rules that you will find all over the world, and almost every person knows about them. Those rules are the 10 Commandments. Now, there's a couple of interesting things when it comes to the 10 Commandments. First, the 10 Commandments come about 1,500 years before Jesus steps on the scene, about 2,100 years before the beginning of Islam. And as I said earlier, you could talk to just about anyone, and they're going to have heard of, they might not know what they are, but they're going to have heard of the 10 Commandments. And maybe you've driven past a billboard that features the 10 Commandments. Maybe you grew up in a home that had the 10 Commandments on a wall somewhere, or maybe your grandmother had the 10 Commandments on a wall somewhere. They're the most famous rules in the world. And as we're working through this and saying, okay, what is the relationship here? How does this work? I want to take you to these. Now, again, a couple of interesting things about the 10 Commandments. Everyone knows the name of them, but very few people know more than 2 of them. And so for many of you here, you know about the 10 Commandments, but if I were to ask you, okay, what are the 10 Commandments? You'd start off and you'd say, I think murder's in there. And then there's, I don't know, is that one in there? I don't remember if that one's in there. I don't know. It's unbelievable. We know about them, but we don't actually know them. And some of you are saying, no, I know them. You're a professional churchgoer. You've been going to church your entire life, and every time the doors are open, you're at church. You're constantly there. You're like, I know them. I guarantee you couldn't get past 5. And then I know there are also some of you here are theologians who say, no. You're saying to yourself, there's actually a debate whether or not there's 9 or 10. Even you, I don't think, could get past 7. It's unbelievable. We know about them, but we don't really know them. And the other thing is, we don't really know where to find them. So if I were to ask you, where are the 10 Commandments? You'd say, well, they're in the Bible, I think. I'm pretty sure they're in there. But where in there? Let me Google that. And so today what I'm going to do, I want to resolve one of those things. And the other one we're going to have to leave unresolved. But I want to make sure all of us know where to find the 10 Commandments. And so on the count of 3, I want you to say after me, I want you to say Exodus, okay? On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Exodus. All right, one more time. 1, 2, 3. Exodus. Exodus. Some of you are saying, what is that? What's Exodus? It's actually a book inside of the scriptures. And you're saying, no, you're making words up. Exodus. What is that all about? The book is actually about how the nation of Israel leaves Egypt, how Moses leads them out of slavery. It's about their exodus from Egypt. And as they're exiting Egypt, they actually are given the 10 Commandments. It's found in the book of Exodus, but more specifically, it's found in Exodus chapter 20. And so on the count of three, say 20. 1, 2, 3. 20. 1, 2, 3. 20. Excellent. Exodus 20. You will now remember that for the next 4 days, and then you will forget. But Exodus 20 is where we find this. And I share that with you because not so much that you know where the 10 Commandments are, but more specifically where you know what it is that we're going to look at. And today we're not actually going to read through the 10 Commandments. So that other thing about knowing all of them, you'll have to look those up in order to be able to know the other 7 that you've forgotten. But no problem, because they're located in Exodus chapter 20. Excellent. Some of you forgot in 5 minutes. But as we go to this, I want to take you here, again, not so that we can see the 10 Commandments, but because before God gives the 10 Commandments, he actually does something really powerful. And I want for you to see what he does before he gives the most famous rules in the world, or I would say the most famous instructions in the world. So we're going to go to Exodus chapter. Excellent. Verse 1, and God spoke all this. So real quick insight, you know who the rules people are? They're the ones who are responding first, okay? For those of you who are here and I'm like, I wonder who rules people are. They're the ones who are responding really quickly when I say that, okay? So Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, it says this. This is right before God gives the most famous instructions in the world. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God. So God's about to give these instructions, but he starts off and he says this. He said, I want you to know, before we go any further, before I lay this out for you, before I share with you something that I know is going to be known around the entire world as it pertains to instructions and as it pertains to rules, let me just make sure that something is very clear first. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God. What? I am the Lord your God. And God starts off and he says, I want you to understand something. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something. That we have a relationship. Now, this would have been shocking. This would have been shocking for the nation of Israel to hear. Why? Well, in order to explain that, let me go back to where we left off last week, because you have to understand that a lot has happened between where we left off last week and what was happening with Abraham and this moment. So last week we talked about the promise that was given to Abraham, and one of those promises is that God stepped in and said, I'm going to turn you into a nation. But Abraham doesn't actually see that happen inside of his life. As a matter of fact, Abraham has 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Out of both of these sons, there are actually nations that are born. The prophet Muhammad comes along and actually traces the Arab nations back to Ishmael. And Islam claims that, no, this is the chosen child, and therefore that seed passed on to the Arab nations. Judaism says, no, the chosen child is Isaac, and that passed on through Isaac. Isaac comes along, and he has 2 sons named Jacob and Esau. Maybe you've heard of them before. Great family dynamic. Jacob is the child who's blessed. He has 12 sons, which is a terrible idea. I can tell you, as a father of 3, 12 sons is it's just not going to go well. It doesn't go well. One of them is named Joseph. You may have heard his story. You may have heard of his coat, this multicolored coat. Joseph's a little arrogant, a little full of himself. His brothers decided to sell him into slavery. I guess that's what you do. So this is how bad it can go with 12 sons. These 12 actually birth the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph is sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. Crazy story. He becomes the prime minister of Egypt, rescues Egypt from a famine. In the process, brings the rest of his family down to Egypt. And as they're inside of Egypt, the Hebrews begin to multiply like rabbits. The Egyptians start to freak out, and they're looking at what's happening and saying, wait, in a little bit, there's going to be more Hebrews than there are Egyptians in Egypt. We've got to do something about this. So they enslave the Hebrews. The Hebrews lived then in slavery for 400 years. And through this whole thing, as they're in slavery, they're hearing stories about Father Abraham. And they're hearing stories about this God who made this promise to their ancestor Abraham and all that he was going to do and how they would become a nation. And there's this land that he was going to give them and how he's going to bless the whole world through them. But you can imagine what it must have been like to be living in slavery. And you see that you're becoming a nation, but you're not becoming a free nation. And it doesn't look like there's any hope of that ever changing. And you're hearing a story that your grandfather told you, but your grandfather was a slave his entire life, never knew freedom. And then he passed away. And now this story is being handed off to you that no, there's this God who's going to do this thing. But after 400 years, you've got to get to the point where you don't believe it anymore. Yeah, okay, great. We're talking about Abraham again, but we're still slaves. Okay, great. We're talking about this God again, but we're still slaves. And nothing is changing. And it doesn't look like anything's going to change. But then God sends an individual named Moses. And Moses comes on the scene. And he says, okay, listen, God wants to do something amazing. And he goes to Pharaoh and says, listen, God wants for you to free his people. I want for you to, and all of us, many of us have heard this line, I want for you to let my people go, right? Many of us have heard this line. If you're older, you can probably hear it in the voice of Charlton Heston because that's where you heard it in the movie. If you're younger, right now you're thinking to yourself, who in the world is Charlton Heston? You don't need to look it up. It's not really worth looking up. I said that there was another person. See, in the second service, someone actually booed me. Apparently, there's a lot more Charlton Heston fans than I thought. Apparently so. And so if I've offended you with that, I'm sorry. I apologize. But as we walk through this, you see Moses steps in, he says, okay, I want for you to let my people go. And Pharaoh says what? No. Nobody knows? None of you knew. Well, yes, you knew. Pharaoh says what? Yeah, it's 12:30. Wake up, people. It's time to go, all right? We're getting the energy up. So Pharaoh says, no, it's not going to happen. And then nature goes crazy. Nature goes crazy. And not just randomly, specifically to the Egyptian people, and specifically after Pharaoh says no each time. But eventually Pharaoh gets to the point where he says, no. Not only does he say, you can go, he actually says, get out, leave. I do not want you here anymore. And Moses leads this nation, this slave nation, if you can even call it a nation, because they'd never organized themselves before. They'd never governed themselves. Of all those who are alive, they've never experienced freedom. Everything that they knew in terms of how they interacted socially was determined by the fact that they were slaves. And then Moses leads this group out into the wilderness, and they come to Mount Sinai. And it's at Mount Sinai where God gives them the 10 Commandments. But he starts off and he says, okay, before we get to the rules, I want for you to know this. I am the Lord your God. So Exodus chapter 20, and God spoke these words, I am the Lord your God. He says, before we go any further, I want you to understand this, that you are mine and I am yours. I want you to understand that we have a relationship to which the nation of Israel would have said, whoa, when did that happen? I mean, we heard stories about you and we heard stories about Abraham and we heard stories, but when did this happen? When did we establish a relationship? When was it that all of a sudden you became our God and all of a sudden we became yours? God says, before we go any further, I want you to understand our relationship. And then as he continues, he actually references back to what I think it is, as he continues, what I think it is that made it possible for this relationship to exist. He says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And he references back to what it is that he just did. And he does two things here. One, he establishes, okay, before we go any further, before we talk through the most famous rules that will ever exist, I want you to understand the relationship that we have. And the other thing that I want you to understand is that I just did this for you without ever requesting anything of you. Listen very carefully. God says, I want you to understand the relationship that we have and that I just did for you, this unbelievable thing, before I ever requested anything of you. And I want you to understand, as we look back at what it is that I did, I want you to understand, what was it that established this relationship? Now to understand that, you have to understand the final thing that actually caused Pharaoh to say, okay, it's time for you to leave. Because as nature is going crazy, Pharaoh continues to say no, until God steps in and says, okay, Moses, I'm going to do something drastic to free my people. And so I need you to go to the Hebrew people and I need you to share this with them. There's something that I want for them to do. This is going to happen on a specific night. And so I want for them to prepare for this specific night. And there's a couple things that I want for them to do. I want for them to prepare a lamb. I want for them to take a lamb and to slaughter that lamb and prepare it for dinner, which would have been normal. I want for them to eat together as a family, to have a feast together as a family, which would have been somewhat normal. But then he also says, I also want them on this day to pack everything that they own and to get ready because they're going to leave that night. And then in addition to that, I want you to take the blood from the lamb that you're preparing, and I want for you to put that blood on the doorposts of the home. So I want you to put it across the top, and I want you to put it down both sides of the door. Now, if you are a professional churchgoer and you grew up in church, for many of us, you read through the story and we think, oh yeah, that's normal. That's what they do. No, it's not. Can you imagine hearing that for the first time? First of all, as Pharaoh has continued to say no, he's also made it harder and harder and harder on them in their slavery. And then Moses comes and says, okay, I know things have gotten a lot worse, even as God's been doing some amazing things, but here's the thing. Here's what I want for you to do. I want you to prepare this feast. Okay, first of all, we're slaves. We don't have a lot of extra, but okay, that seems normal. We'll prepare this feast. And then I want you to pack everything that you own. Nope. Okay, you're telling me after Pharaoh has consistently said no, and you're telling me after 400 years in slavery that night it's going to change. No, I'm not packing. Do you know how much work it takes to pack? Do you know how much work it's going to take to unpack? And I know I'm going to unpack because this isn't going to happen. And then Moses says, oh, and there's this other thing that you need to do. Take the blood and put it, no, what are you talking about? And so many of us, I think we interact with it like, oh, it's probably just something they did. No, it's not something they did. They'd never done it before. Do you know what the neighbors are going to think? What you doing to your door? Okay, son, don't play with those kids anymore. He says, no, here's what I want for you to do. But why? I mean, why do we have to do that? I mean, what difference is it going to make? You know which households are the Hebrew households. Why do we have to do that? I don't understand the significance of that. It's not going to change anything whether I do it or don't do it. I mean, God's going to do what God's going to do. It's amazing if you actually put yourself in the situation and think through what they would be thinking. It's amazing to me how it actually coincides so much with multiple conversations that I've had about baptism. And I'll talk to people about how God calls us to take the step of baptism, and they'll say, what's the significance of that? I mean, Does it save you? No, you're actually saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Well, then what? I don't understand. Why would I have to do that? But in that situation, just as in this situation, God is calling them to do something. What is that? Ultimately, what is it that he's calling them to do? To trust. Are you going to trust me? Remember last week we talked about that? And we said God doesn't ask you to clean up the mess. God calls you to do what? To trust him. And God says, will you trust me? I don't understand. This doesn't make sense. I don't know how yeah, but will you trust me? And so they get to Mount Sinai, and God says, I am yours and you are mine. Wait. When did that happen? When did that relationship get established? When you trusted me. What is it that God taught us about faith several weeks ago? What was it that established Abraham's relationship with God? When he trusted him. And God says, I want you to understand that what I'm about to give you, and what we're about to walk through in terms of the instructions, these are not what make my relationship with you possible. As we walk through this, I want you to know before we ever get into this, that we have a relationship. And I did for you before I ever required anything of you. And that relationship that we have is not based on the fact that you got right what it is that we're about to walk through. The relationship that we have is based on the fact that you trusted me. And then God begins to go through the 10 Commandments. Do you know what the first one is? It's found in Genesis chapter 20, verse 3. It says this: you shall have no other gods before me. What's the first commandment? Value the relationship. We have this relationship. Value the relationship. To which the nation of Israel would have said, no kidding. I mean, look at what you just did. Why would we have any other God before you? Why would we look to undervalue the relationship of someone who actually brought us into relationship before we ever knew the rules? Before you ever even gave the rules. And God says, here's what I want for you to do. Value the relationship. Why? Because, and this is so important, the 10 Commandments were confirmation of. The 10 Commandments were confirmation of, not a condition of, Israel's relationship with God. And God says, I know that you're going to get confused about this, and you're going to think that what I'm about to give you is a condition of your relationship with me. No. It is not a condition. It's confirmation of. We already have the relationship. And I don't want you to get confused. And so before we even get into that, I want to make sure that you understand that this is confirmation of, not a condition of, that relationship. You see, with God, relationship precedes rules. With God, relationship precedes rules. This is so important. So important. And as God steps into our life, he consistently opts for the family model over the club model. God consistently opts for the family model over the club model. In other words, I'm going to instruct you not so that you can become part of the family, but I'm going to instruct you because of the fact that you are part of the family. You see, God instructs those that he loves. He doesn't instruct so that you can earn his love. He instructs those that he loves. He consistently opts for the family model over the club model. And what is it that makes you part of the family? If you trust him. What was it that made Abraham part of the family? He trusted him. What was it that made Israel part of the family? They trusted him.